Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Our guest right now is Dr. Marc Dollinger, professor of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. His book, which came out in 2018, is called Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in 1960s. It's been reprinted several times, including after the George Floyd incident. So, Professor Marc Dollinger, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here. Good evening and Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov to you. So I know that you grew up in a Reform Jewish background. You got involved in dealing with some of the social issues that confront our society. And I know that you write a lot about how to look at the Black Jewish Alliance. But basically, what you've gotten a lot of attention was you believe that Jews have white privilege and we've benefited from white supremacy. So before we get to that, how would you define white privilege?
Yeah, thanks. So I think the better place to start is to look at Jews and race. Race is what's called socially constructed, which means it's certainly about the color of your skin, because that absolutely matters, but it's also about how your group is treated by society. And what's fascinating for me as a scholar of Jewish studies, especially now talking about white Jews, is that in times of our history and in places of our history, we have not been white, we have not had privilege. At other times and other places, we have been considered by the societies around us to be white, and therefore we enjoyed privilege. So for us to have the conversation about, are white Jews white and privileged really requires us to look at specific historical times and places. So the opening that you just gave came from some of my publications and writings related to American Jews after World War II. Because in this country, prior to World War II, as I think a lot of your listeners would be aware, there was tremendous domestic anti-Semitism, and Jews were not considered privileged and not considered white. We know in the last few years, we've had an upsurge in domestic anti-Semitism. We've had, tragically, the worst and most violent instances of anti-Semitism in American Jewish history. So that would portend that we, as white Jews, are not enjoying privilege. Anthropologists call this liminal. We are part of multiple different groups at the same time. So since World War II, for the most part, anti-Semitism has eased a whole lot from where it used to be prior to World War II, and certainly, of course, when you talk about Europe, in the 1920s and 1930s. So we have enjoyed the privilege of being white through education, through professional advancement, through access to healthcare, certainly around policing and law enforcement. We've done well. And I think socioeconomically, we've really climbed the ladder and achieved incredible successes in this country.
Is that because we're white or because we worked very hard? Asians are not white, and they also have achieved tremendous success from hard work. So what makes it white privilege as opposed to just good old-fashioned education and hard work?
Oh, all of the above. Hard education counts, hard work counts, and racial privilege counts. I'm advancing a thesis, and it's so important, and it's sometimes challenging to hold both and. That is, it is possible for Jews to work hard. It's possible for Jews to strive for the highest levels of education. And it's possible for Jews to also get an added benefit of racial privilege. And I think all that's happening. So let me introduce a word called historiography. History is the study of the past. Historiography is how generations of history professors have written about it. And I have found that we've covered really well the Jews in education. We've covered really well Jews in hard work. So what I'm trying to do, and what I did in the Black Power book, was really add a new layer and explore an angle or a perspective that scholars and the general public have not been paying as much attention to. So my book focuses in many ways on what it means for Jews to be white through the 1950s and 60s.
But what I'm trying to ascertain, Professor Dollinger, is that, you're saying it's white privilege and we've benefited from white supremacy, but listen, first of all, anti-Semitism is an all-time high in the last year or so. That's no question about it. And there's certain areas where Jews are restricted from getting into because they're Jewish. So the areas that we've done well, whether it's education and finance, is due to hard work, not because of any kind of privilege, but because of kind of hard work. That's what I'm trying to ascertain as to why it's just because we have white skin, we've advanced. I'm arguing with you that it's not because of our white skin, it's because of other factors that made us successful.
Oh, well, so I'll agree and say both and. It's absolutely the other factors, and it really helps to be white. All of the data, around race sadly tells us when a baby's born, we can determine a whole lot statistically based upon the racial, gender, whatever the status category we're going to have. The thing about racial privilege, it appears to be invisible because it's not as if one day, somebody is going to, grant you something on the basis of your privilege. It can be as simple, and the story I tell is, when I go to 7-Eleven, which is what we have out here on the West Coast, I'm never followed by the security guard, who thinks that I'm going to steal something just because I'm not white, as the case may be. So racial privilege has, from the beginning of U.S. history, really been a dominant causal agent in history. It is determined and helped certainly those that have the privilege against those that don't. And of course, does not deny hard work in education, which also matters. These are complicated phenomenon which are occurring.
Now, if you're not following a 7-Eleven, I think we'll go with the basis of who is committing the most crimes. If Jews are committing lots of crimes, then they would look at Jews in a certain way. If a certain ethnic group is committing more crimes and you walk into a store part of that ethnic group, you're going to be looked at with suspicion. So it's not because of white privilege, it's because of the fact that the preponderance of crime may belong to a certain group in a certain area.
Yeah, well, that's racial profiling. And, one thing that we've been trying to do, at least since the 1960s, if before, is not to come to determinations on people and their behavior based upon the way they present themselves. In fact, that's the way in which these systems of racial hierarchies work and operate.
No, but the fact is, though, and I know we did it in New York, for a while. It doesn't have to just be blacks. If it's any particular group that's going to commit a certain amount of crime, they're going to look at them in a certain way. And if you look at the historical record, I believe in the early 1900s, you look at the New York Times and other not that I like to quote the New York Times too often, but you look at some other publications, and Jews who came in from Eastern Europe, a lot of them were engaged in crime and prostitution and all kinds of other rackets. It was only lasted for one generation. You had Murder Incorporated, you had the Jewish Mafia for a period of time. So certainly if a Jew were to walk into a place, they may have suspected him and might have been racial profiling, but based on the reality of that time. So it's just the reality of the marketplace, so to speak.
No, I disagree. I think that there are going to be white Jews who commit crimes, white Jews who don't commit crimes. There are going to be blacks who commit crimes, black who don't commit crimes. The challenge that we face in our society is when we group people by their status, whether it's a racial status or a religious status, and then come to determinations about their behavior based upon their membership in that group. That's something that we as Jews especially should be concerned about and aware of, for all the times that authorities have considered Jews as Jews to be whatever it is they wanted the Jews to be.
Now, you part of your premise also is that you also say that we have benefit from white supremacy. Define what you mean by that.
Yeah, white supremacy is a notion that if you get sort of VIP status, if you're white, that in the way in which society allocates its resources, folks who are categorized as white get to be supreme. And this is beyond sort of individuals who might be racist. It really goes to the way in which the structures of society are organized in ways that are repeatable and predictable, where those who enjoy higher levels on the racial status ladder are going to get to enjoy disproportionate privilege as a result.
Now, in today's day and age, the Asians are suing some universities because of discrimination. I can tell you places like Columbia, Barnard, NYU have looked to restrict Jewish enrollment. Now, they use the word, they want to have more diversity by getting people coming from all parts of the country, not just New York. New York is a code word for Jews. So you still have where Jews are being restricted on the basis of their religion or race, because we're both religion and a race. So I just don't see the privilege as much. And then again, you also, I think you've been, some of the articles have been critical. You didn't include, there are lots of Jews of color. There are Jews who are Black. There are Jews who come from Arab countries that are dark skinned that also have had some success in this country, not because of white privilege. They're not white.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of questions there. First, we'll look at universities. I have not, it's not my research area, so I have not sort of reviewed the colleges and universities you described, but it seems as if you're describing 2 points simultaneously. One would be the efforts to diversify the undergraduate population, and the second is what you're calling restriction against Jews. I have not read about specific restriction against Jews, and I think you mentioned that it was not framed that way. The notion that all students will learn better by being in a diverse set of undergraduates is established in the educational literature. And it's a whole lot better for everybody if we have universities that look like and represent the larger societies in which we live. Not to mention the equity.
There should be quotas. Should there be quotas based on the population? If you represent X percentage, that's what percentage you should be allowed into universities.
We haven't had quotas in decades.
I know, but I'm saying what you're saying right now, it should be how do you get to reflect the population unless you have quotas?
Oh, no, you reflect the population. First of all, no, we don't need quotas. I think that's really sort of a tagline that gets thrown out there all too quickly in order to divert attention away from the real issue, which is, and I teach at a public university, so I'll speak to public universities. Will our public universities fulfill the public good mandate that we have to educate the populations in our states? I'm in the state of California. I would like to see the top X percentage of graduates from every high school in our state getting into one of our 3 systems of higher education. So that's what we're looking for. And I think that for one group to perceive that it is being harmed because other groups are being included doesn't get us anywhere. And in terms of Jews in the college and universities, we're nothing to worry about. We are doing really, really well in who we're delivering in our populations to higher education. I joke that a bachelor's degree is like the baseline in most American Jewish families, and a graduate degree is probably preferable. You mentioned Jews of color and Black Jews. Absolutely. We haven't mentioned the Jews of color. We're looking at 8 to 12% of the American Jewish population, though if we're including Sephardi, Mizrahi Jews, it's going to go even higher. And of course, interpreting Jews of color on this racial paradigm is going to show that we have an increasingly ethnic and racially diverse American Jewish community, which is going to give us a whole lot more opportunity and certainly plays very well on these larger themes of promoting diversity everywhere in American life.
But yet in your book, you didn't write anything about Black Jews.
Correct. That was a big mistake. So I wrote this book from the sources in the archives. And only after I finished the book did my friends in the Jews of color community reach out to me and give me feedback. You wrote 200 pages on Blacks and Jews and not a single page on a Black Jew. So this is part of my learning as a white man and as one who is moving into this field of race to do all I can to self-reflect and to learn as I go. I'm happy to write that the epilogue of the book, which was not written when I first got the feedback, I was able to at least begin to acknowledge that error in the book and to start writing about it. A second edition of the book will be coming out in about 6 months. It will have an additional chapter, which will talk even more about Jews of color and the relevance here. So I'm looking forward to that.
But are they benefiting from white privilege?
No.
But so they're benefiting from hard work, from education, from other factors that help them succeed.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, Jews of color is a diverse community as well. And experiences are diverse even among all different communities. But if we wanted to sort of look at notions of racial hierarchy, there are divisions between white Jews and Jews of color. And that's something that the organized Jewish community, only since the racial reckoning began, have begun to understand sort of how and why it is that our Jewish organizations have remained predominantly white spaces, even as the numbers of Jews of color have been increasing.
Our guest is Dr. Marc Dollinger, professor of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. His book, which came out in 2018, it's being republished again now. It's called Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. And we're dealing with white privilege. We're dealing with how the professor ascertains that we Jews have benefited from a white privilege. We're going to be right back. Don't go away. Stay tuned.
Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
And we're back. Our guest is Dr. Marc Dollinger, professor of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. His book is called Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. By the way, how did you get involved in even pursuing this whole trend? And we'll talk about also how you're looking differently at the Black Jewish Alliance of 1950s and 1960s. How did you get involved in pursuing this?
Thank you. I appreciate the question, because this was in fact not what I started to do. I was really interested in the Jewish ethnic and religious revival of the 1970s. And to be honest, like, I was raised in the 70s. I'm 58 years old. And I really wanted to understand the Soviet Jewry movement and the rise of American Zionism, because I was very much caught up in that. There's a religious revival. You mentioned that I was raised in the Reform movement. And in my generation, we took much more to tradition than our parents were, sometimes with conflicts in the house around kashrut and things like that. So I began the book by looking at the 1970s. And as I was getting into the research, it drew me back to the 1960s and the social protest movements and all the different sort of ethnic, racial, gender identity groups in the 60s that were, becoming very proud of themselves. And Black Power was at the center. So I started writing on Black Power, and then that drew me backwards to the 1950s to look at the early days of the alliance between white Jews and Blacks. So I researched the book from the 1970s backward to the 50s. And then I wrote it, of course, forwards from the 1950s back to the 1970s. This is the third or fourth title of the book. It's interesting, when you write a book, the title is really the last thing you do. But the first title of the book was Turning Inward, American Jewish Life in the 1970s. And then the second title was Is It Good for the Jews? Power Politics in the 1960s. And then ultimately, just before it went to press, we came up with the title that it has now.
Tim from Queens, New York. Thank you for patiently waiting. Your question for Dr. Dollinger. Go ahead, Tim.
Yes, hi, good evening. A comment and a question. I just want to say I am white and I am Jewish. I grew up very poor with a single mom. I don't know if the professor was ever had his electricity turned off as a child and had to sleep in the dark, or was homeless. I have experienced that. I had to, I remember the city marshals coming to throw us out when when I was a child, because we couldn't afford to pay the rent. And this is, I'm white and as I'm Jewish. So I would love for the professor or anyone listening to point out specifically, not vague notions of privilege, but specifically what white privileges I had. And then we can point, I'm emotional, but this is, I find it offensive, honestly.
What do you find? Go ahead. Are you there? Okay, I think we got the...
I have some sort of racial privilege. But the second point I want to make, the second question is, when it comes to crime, statistically, certain groups commit different crimes. For example, in the Catholic Church, there's a problem with pedophilia. We know that. When it comes to violent crime, Black men commit more violent crime than, let's say, white women. So it certainly makes sense that a police department is going to focus more on Black men than on white women. So you can call that profiling, you can call that whatever you want, you might want to call it statistical facts and common sense and say, well, if a certain group, let's say black men, are committing much more in the way of violent crimes than, let's say, white women, the department is going to focus on that group, and there will be encounters and various police officers. So that's all I wanted to say.
I'll let Dr. Dollinger respond. Well thought out question. Let Dr. Dollinger respond to you. Go ahead, Professor.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate you sharing the story. And certainly I'm not going to speak specifically to your experience, but I can tell you that what you're describing is well described in the literature. To speak about race and racial privilege is not to deny class issues, which is what Tim described, and it's not to deny that so many other impulses are occurring in history. If you get a chance to read the Black Power book, I highly recommend chapter 2, because I get into that very specific idea that Tim was mentioning. When you look at the Great Society, which was Lyndon Johnson's social reform program in the mid-1960s, and he was trying to figure out a way that he could, do what FDR could not do with the New Deal, he ended up creating some class-based lines, which many of our national Jewish organizations, for reasons that I think Tim articulated really well, protested, which is to say there are white Jews in poverty. And statistically,
there are a lot of them, by the way. There are a lot of them. I think after the Blacks and Hispanics, even New York City, the third largest group is Jews. A tremendous amount of Jews in poverty.
Right. And so, my historical research is on the 1960s. I'm not familiar with today, but I can tell you that for whatever you're describing today has its antecedents, even at a time when Jews were enjoying the privilege of whiteness. So yeah, absolutely. I'll share with you that in graduate school, when we give the doctoral qualifying exam, students have to wrestle with class, race, gender, immigration status. We put all these different categories. And in a certain way, you can't do that because different people are going to experience these categories in different ways. And that said, my area of research is on Jews and race. So I'm looking specifically at the notion of racial privilege and describing how that interacts. In terms of crimes, it's not my scholarly research area. I can't give you data and statistics, and I can't speak as a scholar, only as a person to say that I think the last thing we as Jews want is profiling. And I think that we need to find ways that each and every individual enjoy basic rights, and that those rights are not taken away because they happen to be a member of a particular group. For whatever reasons that authorities,
But doesn't profiling work? Take Israel. They profile what a terrorist or would-be terrorist would be, and that saved lives. To a certain, if you're really going to be safe, and if we're living today with a lot of crime that's prevalent around the country, if you don't engage in some kind of profiling, you can be prone to having a lot more crime and not solving the issue.
Yeah, so I think every single human being is entitled to basic human rights, and that we should not be discriminating on group status. I think it's a really, really challenging line to figure out how we're going to do that, especially given Jewish history.
Tim, thank you for your question. Before we move on to our next call, Professor Dollinger, are Hasidic Jews or Orthodox Jews, are they considered also to have white privilege?
Yeah, thank you. This is really an important question, and it's one that we've been hearing so much about, sadly, in recent years with violent attacks against, and now we'll say white Jews who are presenting through their clothing, right, and from where they live, and through habits and rituals that they're Jewish. So here again, we see the interplay of anti-Semitism against white Jews who are presenting as Jewish, along, with the privilege that is going along with folks who are white.
My question to you is, Professor Dollinger, if a Hasidic Jew makes it big, is it because of white privilege or because, again, it's hard work? Because a Hasidic Jew is certainly very observable as Jewish, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism, doesn't even get reported against Hasidic and Orthodox Jews, that they walk in the street, you can certainly know who they are. When they walk into a corporate boardroom, you know who they are. So are they making it because of white privilege, or are they making it because of their own hard work? I would just want to get like a clear yes or no answer, what you think about that.
Oh, thank you. I'll go back to my earlier answer, which is it's not either or, it's both and. That clearly they're getting success because of hard work and education, and they're getting success because they're defined higher on the racial privilege, and they're not getting as much racial privilege if they're identifying publicly as Haredi in New York City, given the anti-Semitism and the violence. I think everything you just said.
They're not getting ahead because of their because of white privilege. They're getting ahead because of the hard work, because there's discrimination against them.
There is discrimination and there's privilege, and this is the thing about Jews. We hold both at the same time. What I said, anthropologists call it liminality, and it's challenging for Jews to hold that we can be both privileged and not privileged at the same time.
Jeffrey Manhattan, thank you for waiting. Your question for our guest.
Yeah, hi, Professor. I just want...
just lower your radio, please. Yes.
Yeah, okay, hold on. Thanks. You guys can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Professor, which would you rank as our primary privileges? The fact that observant Jews in many places and at many times have to remove their yarmulkes when they walk in the street. So, like Berkeley, our student council because they're just assumed to support Israel, and even if they do support Israel. So I want to know which of these are our main privileges. I also want to know, on the one hand, you said, and I agree, people should be judged by who they are, not by what membership they are in a group. I agree with you. And yet at the same time, you said that college admissions should reflect the percentage in the population of each group. Does that mean that we should have 1.5 or 2 Jews in every 100 college student? And even though a lot of Jews have won Pulitzer Prizes and Nobel Prizes, we should limit Jews in the science. And finally, when you have anti-discrimination, and equity laws, shouldn't we also put in anti-discrimination? Because if you're discriminated, you're not free. So I really first want to know, which of these privileges are we most lucky to have? That we're attacked on the streets, that our stores and synagogues are attacked.
Okay, we got that.
Unlike Italians or Greeks or anybody else, or Black Sport Africa. And one more question. This country, besides Israel, when people of
Jeff, I have a little trouble hearing you, so I'm going to let the professor respond to your question. Go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, and I got a bunch of it. A lot of it was broken up. So I clearly got the idea that you have to take the kippah off. That's of course not privilege. That's just awful. And you made a mention about synagogues, and clearly that's not privilege, and that's awful too. A bit later, you talked about student councils and Jews in Israel, and I'll use this to plug. I'm writing a new book. I'm almost done with it. It's going to be published by Indiana University Press. It's about campus anti-Semitism in particular. Zev didn't mention in my introduction, but I was actually hired at San Francisco State to be the public face of Jewish life at a university which is widely known as one of the nation's most anti-Semitic places. So my entire career has been fighting anti-Semitism on the college campus. And I have a book which is going to be a bit of a memoir to describe that. College admissions, no, I'm not asking for a strict percentage according to the number of Jews. And in fact, that goes to the earlier point that Jews are overrepresented, which is actually a sign of our privilege. It is to say that if we do look in the same way that Jews were not admitted to colleges and universities, back in the early part of the 20th century.
When you say Jews are overrepresented, again, if it's a merit-based system, then we were not overrepresented.
Overrepresented. Well, I think that the caller described the percentage of Jews in the United States against the percentage of Jews in the university. That's what I meant by overrepresented. Meaning
Jeff, you have a quick 30-second response to the professor. You have to lower your radio.
Yeah. I thought it was off. Yeah, you're the face of defending us in San Francisco. Honestly, with friends like this, we don't need enemies.
Well, let's not disparage, the professor. He has his viewpoints.
I'll say this respectfully, but there was, I do a lot of political work, and there was some candidate that had a Jewish staff member that said the Upper West Side is too white, and in particular too Jewish, and he was Jewish, and he was saying, well, I'm a cool Jew because I sell out my own people because I know that it's not really good to be Jewish or something like that. And I hate the cliche self-hating Jew, but like I think, and I don't know you, but I think you and a lot of Jews are forced to sell out and to sell out.
Okay, Jeff, I'm gonna let the professor respond, but I disagree with you. Listen, I don't agree with the professor's positions, but I don't believe he's a self-hating Jew. He has just his way of looking at it.
Talking about him, I was talking about that person in particular. So
let's be very clear about it.
But I just want to say real quick that where young Jews are forced to show how cool they are by showing, well, I'm a Jew, but I agree that Jews have too much this, too much that, instead of seeing all the suffering. And again, look at the numbers at the Met Council, how many poor Jews are serviced by them. And I want to say one more thing, but I forgot it. So
but anyway, Jeff, we're out of time because we have a lot of calls. But then thank you for your call. Professor, you want to respond?
Oh no.
Okay, we're looking at the Black-Jewish relation, where we're looking at the fact that the Professor Dollinger has labeled Jews as being part of white privilege and benefiting from white nationalism. And he has a couple of books out. One of them is being reissued, as I said earlier, and that's dealing with blacks and Jews. And he has a new one coming out dealing with campus anti-Semitism. And we're going to continue our conversation right after these messages. You're listening to the Talkline Network.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
And we're back. Professor Marc Dollinger, our guest, professor of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. His book is called Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance of the 1960s. Let's go to Stan in Forest Hill. Stan, your question for our guest. Go ahead, Stan.
Well, I have a comment and a question. This ridiculous theory that I've heard before that white privilege really is bogus. It doesn't really exist. Yeah, we've been white for almost 2,000 years. Okay, but the problem is many of us like to change our name and hide behind race, but it's never been a privilege. It's been used when we had to go to war or if we had to do other things and so forth, but mostly the time most would change their name or have their nose done or things like that. So the race itself is bogus. Your theory is moot. It really doesn't exist. Once you say a name or that gives it away, or other things give it away. So the race is a shield up to a point, but it doesn't protect the Jew at all. I know that, and you know that. It didn't protect 6 million, so it didn't make a difference whether they were white or not. White privilege doesn't exist overall. It is because we're white and so forth. That's the way it is. But it's never been a privilege. It's been a birth situation. Okay?
So your question to the professor is?
Well, his theory is bogus. I don't think he can defend his theory. I don't think he is defending.
He is defending. Professor.
That doesn't mean let him defend his theory. What I just said.
All right, let the professor respond to you. Go ahead,
Professor. Go ahead.
I invite Stan to pick up a copy of the book and read through it. The notion of whiteness, race, privilege in U.S. history and American Jewish history is well founded in the literature. It's certainly not anything in the few minutes I have left that I'm going to be able to convince you to change what a set mind. So,
all right,
of course, I didn't think he'd answer it. No, he did. Of course, he wouldn't answer it. Of course not.
That's it. That's his privilege. Anyway, thank you for your.
Okay, yeah, just prove my point. But okay, no problem. Thank you.
All right, let's go to Gila in, I believe it's Brooklyn, right, Gila? Let's go ahead to Gila. Your question or comment for Dr.
Flatbush. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi Brenner, for putting on. I want to say something to the professor. First of all, if you go back in history, many of the disciplines closed off to Jews, banking, professorships, Ivy League colleges. I also tell him that I know a sociology professor in Brooklyn College. He cannot walk down the hall without comments being made. Is that privilege? I also want to tell him about the following thing with a young lady who years ago applied to Sears and Roebuck. And when she said she couldn't work on Shabbat, the interviewer said, you won't be needing this application now. And Nat Lewin had a case, and he won the case. Where is the white privilege? Where the privileges are is when you have things like affirmative action. And that is privileges. It is not the white privilege and Jews. From the time they came over on Ellis Island, the sweat of their brow, they worked to rebuild lives after being thrown into ovens and crematoria. I don't see where your theory has any basis. I agree with Stan. Thank you very much.
Is this the first time you've agreed with Stan on this, Gila?
See that we're alive to debate you because your theory has no basis and it is typical of San Francisco that wanted to do away.
Okay, Gila, I'm going to let the professor respond to you. But is this the first time you're agreeing with Stan?
Yes.
Okay. All right, Gila, I'll let the professor respond. Go ahead, Professor Dollinger.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Gila. I actually agree with everything that you said. Because as I stated earlier in the broadcast, whiteness and privilege is socially constructed and it's contingent, which means, and this is why I think as a Jewish studies scholar, and this is the place to be in academia, everything you said is true and privilege is also true. How can we as the Jewish people have suffered genocide within our lived memory at the same time that we're enjoying privilege of whiteness in contemporary, or at least post-World War II America? So my teaching is not to say either or. My teaching is to say both and. And you mentioned affirmative action, so I want to do a quick plug. I did a whole chapter in my first book on affirmative action and quotas and the debates within the Jewish community around that. It's called Quest for Inclusion, Jews and Liberalism in Modern America. So I recommend that one for you too.
Gila, thank you for your phone call. I appreciate it. We have a few moments left. You have a few moments left, Professor. So my question to you is, you look at the Black-Jewish alliance as being changed, and I know it changed and with Black militancy and Black power, that's affected the dialogue between Blacks and Jews, has it not?
Yeah, so I actually have a three-part theory on that. The first is that way back in the 1950s, sort of the golden age of the civil rights movement, at least when most of our memories really reflected that everything was perfect. I noticed that even the Jewish leaders at the time understood fundamental differences between being white and Jewish and being Black in America. And they actually predicted the eventual end of the alliance, which occurred in the mid-1960s. That's part one. Part two, even as it was a fractious debate, fractious dissolution of the alliance, especially for those of you in New York City, I found that there was tremendous empathy among rabbis for the Black Power movement. And I was shocked to read it, which is how that book title came up. And then what I found in the 1970s is that Jewish organizations, Soviet Jewry, American Zionism, rabbis looking for greater ritual observance were playing on the ideology and tactics of Black power, which is to say, if Black is beautiful, so is Jewish. And if Blacks are going to, protest in the streets for racial equality, Jews will protest in the streets for Soviet Jewry or for Zionism. And I was really stunned to see that even though the alliance ended in the mid-60s, it sort of realigned itself in a parallel fashion.
In fact, the birth of the Jewish Defense League, Rabbi Meir Kahana's militant organization, was solely based, Jewish power was based on Black power, Jewish is beautiful. Some of the slogans of the Black Power movement was quickly adopted by the JDL when it was formed in the 1960s, I believe.
Kahane loved the Oakland-based Black Panther Party, which went into the state capitol in Sacramento with shotguns. And clearly, he was not interested in the issue of racial justice. He was interested in his perspectives of Jewish justice, but he was quite open about the fact that he was emulating what was happening in the Black community.
Professor Marc Dollinger, Professor of Jewish Studies, San Francisco State University. His book is called Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance of the 1960s. Your new book will be out when?
In about a year from Indiana University Press. Does not yet have a title, but it will be on Campus Anti-Semitism.
And thank you for joining us.
A pleasure. Thank you all. Shavua Tov.